On a cold afternoon, the hours seemed chained together in Los Angeles. The sharp wind swept mercilessly through the narrow streets of Skid Row, the roofs of makeshift shacks creaking, and the smell of despair hung in the air. This was a place where souls forgotten by time gathered. Each one carried the burden of unfulfilled dreams, lost hopes, and the weariness of a life exhausted. Among them, there was an old woman wrapped in a thin, torn blanket, her body trembling against the cold, trying to shield herself from the cruel wind like a shadow. In a luxury car, Barron Trump was leaning against the edge of the window, his eyes distant. His mind was clouded, struggling to shake off the worldly thoughts but unable to do so. He had passed through this street before, but this time something was different. There was a gaze that seemed to pull him in. Something about it was drawing him closer. For a moment his heart raced and he felt a deep sorrow in his chest. He paused for a moment, wanting to deny what he was feeling. Life could change in an instant. A person could be safe, happy, and surrounded by love one day, and the next find themselves battling cold, hunger, and loneliness. He knew this theoretically, but had never truly witnessed it. He had never felt it this deeply. The car came to a stop at a red light. Barron's heart began to beat faster as he looked at the woman. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale, and life had etched every line on her face. In that moment he realized. He knew her. It was Mrs. Henderson, Barron's childhood teacher, the one who taught him how to read and write, believed in him, and supported him. Back then, she was a woman full of life, someone who had overcome everything. But now she was just a shadow, lost in the years of suffering and disappointment. Barron's stomach tightened. How could this have happened? A person who had dedicated their life to teaching children, to helping others, could end up forgotten and destitute. His breath caught in his throat. He had passed by so many times before, never noticing, but now it was as if a thunderclap had struck him. It was overwhelming. The car slowly rolled closer to the curb, and Barron opened the window. He took a step out of the car, each movement feeling heavier than the last. "Mrs. Henderson?" His voice was barely above a whisper. The woman looked up, her eyes blank, almost lifeless. But for a second, something flickered in her gaze. Recognition, disbelief, a touch of shame. A single tear rolled down her worn cheek. It was as if that one tear spoke volumes, carrying years of unspoken pain. She wrapped her blanket tighter around herself, as though protecting whatever was left of her dignity. "Barron!" Her voice trembled. Barron's heart skipped a beat. "It's me." The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken words and the weight of years gone by. Barron knelt down in front of her, looking into her eyes. "What happened?" he asked, but deep down he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. The woman lowered her gaze. Her voice was calm, but there was a sense of finality in it. "Life happened." They stayed silent for a moment, but then she began to speak again. She once had children, a family that she loved dearly, but as time passed, they began to drift away. At first, it was the illness that made her struggle, but she thought her family would always be there for her. Eventually, the phone calls grew fewer, the promises broken, and the silence became deafening. She had sold her home to cover medical bills, holding on to the hope that her family would support her in return. But instead, all she received were excuses and a cold, unfeeling silence. And one day, when she could no longer afford anything, she was left with nothing but the cold streets of the city. "I never expected," she continued, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't think anyone would find me." Barron's hand tightened around his steering wheel, feeling the weight of her words. "I remember you," he said, his voice firm. For a moment, the woman's eyes softened. "You remember me?" she asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. There was a flicker of hope in her tired eyes. "I do," Barron said softly. "I always will." The woman, for the first time in years, felt something like security in Barron's touch. His presence, His willingness to help made her feel human again. She stood up slowly, supported by Barron, who had offered her his arm. Her body, fragile and delicate, seemed weighed down by the years of hardship. But as she stood, Barron could feel her spirit beginning to lift. "I can't go to a hotel," she said softly, her voice filled with hesitation. "I don't belong there." Barron looked at her with determination. "You do belong. You belong with respect." For a moment, Mrs. Henderson hesitated, but then she allowed herself to trust Barron. They went to a warm hotel room where she took a long, hot shower. As the water washed away the grime and exhaustion of years spent struggling on the streets, she felt a sense of relief, as if she was being reborn. She sat down to eat a hot meal and drink a glass of wine, a luxury she hadn't had in years. As she ate, she looked at Barron, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Barron smiled gently. "Because once you helped me. Now it's my turn." For the next week, Barron took care of her. He arranged for medical care, legal support, and provided her with a safe place to live. But more than that, he helped her rediscover the dignity and worth she had lost. He gave her not just a roof over her head, but a chance to stand tall again. Each day, Barron helped her regain a sense of purpose. He brought her new clothes, new hope, and most importantly, he brought her back to life. Weeks later, Mrs. Henderson was back in the classroom. Her students, now grown, looked up at her with admiration. As she wrote on the chalkboard, she felt as if something deep inside her had been restored. For the first time in years, she felt whole again. Barron had not only given her a roof, but had helped her regain everything she had lost: her self-respect, her dignity, and her purpose. When asked why he had done so much, Barron's answer was simple. "You taught me what it means to be human. Now it's my turn to give that back." The weeks turned into months, and Barron continued to support Mrs. Henderson. She became a symbol of hope, not only for the homeless, but also for Barron. He realized that it was not enough to have wealth or power if one did not have compassion and kindness. In helping her, Barron had rediscovered the true meaning of life. Mrs. Henderson, now living comfortably, continued to teach, and Barron would visit her often, reminding her that she had a place in the world, no matter how much time had passed or how many people had forgotten her. The woman who had once lost everything now had more than just the basics. She had her dignity, her purpose, and her belief in the goodness of others. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, don't miss the next story. A new story awaits you every evening.